Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Spooney Scrapbook. Of course, that's John Sponheimer. I'm Mike Kenichi, and we are very happy to be here. This is episode 3. So far, we've touched on 1972, 73, 74, 75, and of course, last week, 76. It is my honor to introduce to you the one and only Coach Sponheimer. And, Coach, thank you again. This is a lot of fun.
Mike, well, the high school season has started, so it's great to talk about many years of Ansonia football and Valley football at the same time.
Yeah, so real quick, talk to me. How did it feel to be back out there last week? I know anytime the season starts, it's got to be like Christmas Eve for you coaches. You get excited and had to be a real thrill to be back out there last week.
It certainly is, Mike, because then you get into the weekly routine of games and preparing for specific teams and the scouting, the film analyzation, and just being on a more urgent basis, so to speak, on a week-to-week basis than you are in preseason or just through the scrimmage schedule. So it's great to be back, Mike.
Right. So, Coach, one of the things I wanted to talk about before we get into 1977, one of the big things that really is helpful to coaches is, of course, going over game film. So just talk to me a little about that, especially in 1977, when you guys are watching game film. I mean, just let people out there who are listening who may not understand that. What do coaches look for when they're watching those films?
Well, you try and see if there's any patterns teams are using. You're trying to see, especially now with so many games so many teams being in the spread offense. Who are the better receivers? What particular patterns they're running? The game has changed so much over the last decades as far as running versus passing now, and so you're preparing for a lot more passing. And if you can cover teams in zones or man-to-man, there's always a lot of decisions to be made, especially against teams that have multiple fine receivers.
Right, and think about this, Coach. If you're watching a game you guys played on a Friday night and you're going over film Saturday morning, that probably takes a good 2 hours to go over, correct?
No, it definitely does when you're breaking down each individual play and each particular player on your team on that film. And then plus you're already looking at films from the other team. And I mean, there's so much, everybody's involved with huddle now where teams are transferring or sending other teams films. Back when we first started, you would just film your own games. And teams were always looking to get a film of another opponent from maybe a coach they knew, but there was very, very little, if at all, exchanging of films. Hypothetically, if we were playing Derby, we didn't exchange films with Derby before the game. But every now and then, different teams were close to other teams and might have an opportunity to look at their particular film. But that's all changed now. Everybody's film is basically on huddle. There's all exchanging between teams if you don't have their film already. It started with the CAC playoffs when some of the rules were exchanged films, and some of the coaches, I won't get into it, but they were very interested in exchanging the films because sometimes you didn't get the complete film. You only got partial films or different films which were not applicable to the team you were playing. So, and it was such a short period of time to analyze those films. So, but now teams put their films on huddle, and it's just much more easy to get it.
Right, and I really think about when I watch these old Ansonia and Derby games from the 60s and 70s. It's amazing to me, like how it was filmed back then, obviously on a reel-to-reel. So that had to be difficult at times for coaches to go over game film because back then you didn't get the best look. And I thought Bubba Green did a great job when he recorded them, but I mean, it was a lot difficult back then to kind of really break it down.
Teams like Ansonia and Derby had very good cameraman, and they had pretty good access from their press box for filming. But now for years we used to when the film was done, Bubba would give us the film and we would take it up to a place in Monroe where it would be ready for us the next day. We played mainly on Saturdays then. You take it up Saturday afternoon, and Coach McAllister would go back up there Sunday to get it, and we would meet Sunday night to go over the film for at least a couple of hours with the players.
Yeah.
And but there was not an awful lot of film of the other teams around in those days. But that's why it was so much more scouting, going to see teams play personally and doing scouting by writing down their plays and trying to analyze what teams did based on what you had from your personalized scouting.
Right. And that was challenging in itself because you got to write down all the ways they line up, different parts of the defense and offense. So I mean, that was challenging back then too. I mean, it's amazing to me how coaches throughout the state went to different schools to scout because I mean, that was a lot of work too.
It certainly was.
Yeah, and I'm sure there were times you guys played maybe a 10:30 game and you had to go to a 1 o'clock game afterwards to scout. So I mean, that in itself, you guys were always busy all the time. That's for sure.
Yes, we were, Mike. Yes, without
Yeah.
a doubt.
So, Coach, talk to me. You come off the 1976 season, big year. You win the first ever Class S championship, and you got Sandy coming back. I believe he's a junior in '77, correct?
That is correct.
Right. In 1977, did you guys feel like you could repeat?
We thought we had a very good team. Obviously, you start with Sandy. His number one receiver, Tommy Laurel, was back. We had some outstanding people. We lost Howie Tinney in the backfield. We still had Mark Goomis. We still had Michael Parks. Gary Eaton was going to be another running back. We had started 5 sophomores or 6 sophomores in the '76 team. So we had Steve Mankiewicz, Ronnie Bellabon, Curtis Antrim. Besides Sandy and Michael Parks, and we also and Tommy Lawler, and we had some outstanding. We had 4 outstanding senior captains. I believe it was Mark Goomis, Vinnie Holcomb. I don't want to miss anybody, but David Goggins, and I'm trying to think of the 4th right now, but it'll come to me. But we had a lot of players who just played one way on that team, like Jack Shepard was a linebacker, Jeffrey Kirkus was a defensive back, Mike Simon was a had started the year before for us also. So we had Jimmy Smith was coming in as a tight end. David Devitt was a senior who had an outstanding year. So I mean, there were some very, very fine high school football players that we knew from the first whistle that we had a pretty good team that would be in almost every game no matter what.
Right. And Coach, one thing about those, you talked about starting sophomores the year before you had started like 6 of them or whatever. That was something in Ansonia that they were never afraid to do. If that sophomore was good, he was going to play. It didn't matter that he was a young kid. You guys were going to give him that opportunity if he was good.
Absolutely. I mean, if you're talented enough to play and you showed it through the scrimmages, you'd play. And it seemed like almost every year we had some sophomores play who really, really stood out.
Right. So talk to me a little bit about the freshman, Coach. I mean, at this point, it's your 6th season, I believe, as freshman coach, and you had an undefeated season. So how did the freshmen look in '77? Because as you could see, Ansonia just they were there every year at that point from like '76 till '85. I mean, they were always involved in the championship game.
Well, '77 was a very fine freshman team. We did go undefeated. We had Billy McAllister, Timmy McNamara on that team, and we also had Bobby Musto. We had an outstanding lineman in David Gracken, who was an eventual All-Stater. We had Joe DiVincenzo on that team, Chris Ventry. We had a lot of really good players, and what we were able to do is that team the next year in '78. Billy McAllister started right away as a sophomore. Some other sophomores played quite a bit in that year, but then later in '79, we had primarily a junior team that with some outstanding seniors, but primarily a junior team that brought us to a state title. So the '77 freshman team had an outstanding nucleus, and as I said, it did go undefeated, and I don't think there were any close games. It was just a real solid team.
And let me ask you, Coach, because each year you're having these kids come up from eighth grade. So I assume there was midget football back then, maybe junior midget. But did you keep in touch with the Pop Warner coaches? Did they kind of provide you like some type of scouting report on the kids you had coming up to freshman year? Did you go to Pop Warner games? I mean, how
I
did you know going into freshman year, like who you were going to have as your line, your quarterback, all that stuff?
I might have gone to one or two Pop Warner games a year just because I wanted to see Billy McAllister play. But he played up in Seymour, as a matter of fact. But I went to see him play, because I coached with his dad, and I would probably see one Ansonia freshman game every year. I knew the families, and it was good to see. In those days too, the weights were somewhat limited for Pop Warner. I think the most you could weigh was 125, 130 pounds. They would let you gain a half a pound a week. And so many times we ended up with freshmen who had only played one year of Pop Warner, maybe no years of Pop Warner because of the weight classification. So they really had to just start from scratch as freshmen. But we knew what their athletic abilities were, and we were able to fold them into the program right away. I mean, I talked about 1977. A kid like Mark Loomis was just big. He never played. He never played youth football until he was a freshman. He came right in. He was a fullback. He was an outstanding high school fullback, and he was able to play from the first whistle as a freshman. So, and there were a number of other people in those shoes, but the Pop Warner program certainly was very advantageous to us and very, very helpful. It was just too bad in those days the weight limits were what they were, because that was somewhat of an issue.
Right. And Coach, also, I know in the '90s you had access to it, but it's also important for freshman players to have somebody filming their games as well, because you want to be able to go over stuff with them, break down the game and stuff. Were you able to have Bob recording most of your freshman games back?
We would film one or two a year usually. It wasn't quite with the level of the varsity, but we would try and do it somewhat early on to show them on film when they can actually see what we were trying to get through to them. And other than a couple of homemade movies that parents might have had, it's the first time they really saw it. And it was a different thing as far as not just watching somebody play for the sake of seeing how the boy's playing, but actually as a teaching tool. So that was extremely helpful to us and still is.
Right. So talk about '77 now. Who did you guys open the season with that year? Do you recall?
Yes, we did. Once we went into the NVL, we opened with Holy Cross, and then we followed it with Shelton. And Holy Cross was a very good team in '77. And Shelton always was a good team. We were very fortunate over the years to have a lot of success against Shelton and even against Holy Cross once we joined the NVL. And then you go Kennedy, Sacred Heart, Torrington, Derby, Watertown. Watertown was very good in '77. Derby had somewhat of a down year in '77. They had an outstanding senior class the year before, and they just weren't quite as good as they had been in the past. But it was still Derby, and then we went on for the first time, I think, in many, many years. Ansonia and Naugatuck came into the Thanksgiving Day game undefeated.
Oh, wow.
And interestingly enough, Sandy Oshesky had gotten hurt three games before, and he sat out the Crosby game and the Wilby game. And he came, and David Debish, who had been the freshman quarterback with the 1974 freshman, became the quarterback. He did a great job. And Sandy came back, practiced the whole week of the week before we were going to play Naugatuck. And then on Saturday morning, we scrimmaged Newington, who was a very good team. That's when they were starting to get really good in a couple of years. They were number one in the state. We had a real good scrimmage with them. And on Saturday morning, we were scouting. We were going to the FCAC championship game to see Stanford Catholic, who was our eventual opponent in the playoffs. And all of a sudden, we got a call from Sandy's personal doctor that he couldn't play anymore. He really practiced and played the whole week because there was concern about his back and his health. So all of a sudden, with 3 days practice, Devers came back in at quarterback, and we went up to Naugatuck, and it was just a great game, and we ended up winning 19-0. As I said, both teams were undefeated. And then after Sandy went to a number of doctor's appointments, he was cleared to play, I believe, on Tuesday of the playoff week. And he came back, and on the first play of the playoff game, he threw about a 40 or about maybe a 50-yard touchdown pass to Tommy Lawler for a touchdown. He came back to another touchdown at Tommy Lawler in the first quarter. And we went on to beat Stanford Catholic, who had lost to Trumbull in the FCAC game 9-6. We ended up beating them 19-7 and ended up winning the state championship. But it was really nerve-wracking for the Olszewski family, for the Ansonia football team. And all of a sudden we thought we had Sandy back, and then we didn't have him.
Yeah.
Especially for playing Naugatuck with both teams undefeated, but we were able to get by that and move on to win the state championship.
And that, I always thought about the players that were backups because they were always ready to go in if needed. And I mean, I think about, we'll get to it at some point, but I'll just touch on it briefly. 95 was a good example. Luke Richmond couldn't play against Derby. His back was bothering him. And he had a good backup in Stephen Coughlin, who was your wide receiver. So, I mean, you guys always had those backups if needed. Now, it's kind of hard to replace somebody like Sandy, but obviously the team knew how to win, and it didn't really miss a beat against Naugatuck.
Right. David Devers was also an exceptional athlete. He was a first-team registered All-Stater. He was a scholarship player going to UConn. So, I mean, he wasn't Sandy, but he was a pretty good player.
Right. So, Coach, you brought this up, and it was something I remember for many years. You talked about always playing Holy Cross and Shelton the first 2 games, and for a long time, the schedule stayed the same every year. I mean, how they did it was you just played the same teams in the same week every year. Like I know Derby played Brantford the first game for a number of years, and then I think how it finally started to change was Brantford spoke up and said, we're tired of playing them the first game every year. But for a long time, they didn't have like the schedules like they do now, where they mix it up every 2 years.
No, I mean, because we were always played Derby in the 6th game. We could tell you their exact schedule. They could tell you ours for 30 years. It was always the same.
Yeah, it definitely was. And let me ask you, Coach, did you think at that point being in the league also helped Ansonia? Because, I mean, I think you needed those points back then too, right, to make the playoff, and there were only 2 teams. But I think, like, while it was good they played in an independent schedule, being in a league was something that never mind the football program, the whole athletics needed.
Well, one thing that helped also, though, our 2 out-of-league games were Derby and Shelton. Yeah. We always beat Shelton, and they were a double L team. I think from the playoff start of 1976, we stopped playing them after the 1993 season. We beat Shelton every year with the exception of 1986. Right. So we picked up an awful lot of points. They were a double L team, and during that period, I mean, Derby beat us sometimes, but we for the most part had the upper hand, and Derby would have usually 8-9 wins, and very 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 outstanding football teams, and we were fortunate. But if you're playing everybody in the league, it sort of balances off for the most part, because if they beat each other, you get your 10 points from one team as opposed to the other if you're playing both teams. But we did, especially the Shelton successes were extremely important to us as far as the state playoffs were concerned.
Right. And I always thought it was good that Shelton and Ansonia played the second game of the year, because it was a Valley rivalry. And in Ansonia's case, they got to wait to play Derby week 6. That's their big rival. And Shelton's big rival was Derby, which they had to wait till Thanksgiving. So it kind of gave both teams something to play for, like, early in the season to kind of get pumped up, because while you always want to win your league and you always want to beat those teams, I don't think you get as pumped up playing North Haven or playing Crosby like you do for Shelton or Derby. It's a different feel for the kids.
No, absolutely not. And especially when Shelton, a number of years Shelton would go 9-1 and only lost to us, and so we knew we were playing an outstanding Shelton team, and or they go 8-2, and we were one of their 2 losses. But it's too bad we don't play them anymore. And they had some outstanding football teams in the last 20 years. So it would have meant for some great games, and I think they probably would have won their share. But we're fortunate enough to say that when we played them, we won.
Right. And Coach, let me ask you this, because since we're talking about it, obviously you met Seymour a couple of times in the playoffs, and you played them your 11th game a couple of times, but you really didn't start to play them on a consistent basis till 1994. Did a part of you feel like teams like Derby, Shelton, Ansonia, Seymour, I'll even throw Naugatuck in there as well, should have played each other every year, like in some way, like they should have made that happen?
You would have liked it, Mike, but the only way that could have been done if there was always an 11th game, and that was the way the CIAC was. They didn't want to start the season too early, unfortunately. But we did play Shelton in Seymour in 74, 75. We played an extra game. We played Amity in 80. We did go back and play Seymour again in 85 and 86. We played them again in 91.
Yeah.
And then they came into the league in 94. So, and they've been one of our rivals ever since then.
Yeah, and which, losing that Shelton game was unfortunate, but at least Seymour, they weren't a bad substitute for Shelton. And like you said, they've kind of become one of your big rivalries.
They absolutely have.
Yeah.
They've got some talent. They're very talented every year. They have an excellent coaching tree there, and they're always going to be a real tough game to play, both home and away.
Right. So talk about 77 against Derby, because you had finally got that, you kind of erased that demon of losing the Derby for so many years, and you beat them twice in 76. So talk about 77. I mean, it wasn't the best Derby team, but again, you knocked Derby off for a second straight year. I think Coach McAllister had to feel good because he could finally see that Ansonia was making that a rivalry once again. It was always a rivalry, but you have to win sometimes for it to be a rivalry.
We won by a bigger score, but by the same token, the game was still Derby. We were as fearful of Derby in 77 as we were in 76 once you're playing them. And you had great respect for any Goody football coach team. And we were just fortunate that we got a pretty good jump on them. And they just weren't quite as talented overall as they had been in the past, but they still were tough Derby kids. They fought right to the end. So we were very happy to take our win and move on.
Right. And you had talked about, and he since has passed on, but a good receiver for you guys in Tommy Lawler. And I mean, people forget how underrated he was because, if you look back at his stats and stuff like that, I mean, he was always the type of guy that made big catches for your football program.
He absolutely did. He absolutely was one of the best receivers you ever had at Ansonia. Started as a sophomore, and he started as a tight end. I mean, he wasn't even a wide receiver then for us. He wasn't that big, but he was very tough, and he had great hands and great moves. And then the next year he became a split end, and then the following year in '78 I thought he was the best receiver in the state. And all of a sudden after the 6th game, he fell in practice and fractured his wrist, and he was done for the last 4 games in the state playoff. And that was a major loss to us as a football team. He was the best receiver by far we had, and he had a huge game against Derby in '78. And I think he played one more game against a very good Watertown team, fell in practice, and he was going as far as a wide receiver for us.
Yeah, and that's the unfortunate thing is getting hurt, because you hate to see any of these kids lose, especially their senior season.
Right. Yep. And that can happen to any team. I mean, and every team has a crushing injury or two. It was just a shame that it happened to a senior who was such a great receiver for Sandy Olszewski.
Right. So talk about the 77 state title game. I mean, you go back to back here, and I mean, you win in 76, and I'm sure you get that first. It's funny. People even hear fans say this, especially like with any team they root for. Oh, just give me one and I'll be fine with that. But once you get into that competition, I mean, you want to win every year. You're not just going to rest on your laurels. So even though 76 was wonderful, you guys were even more determined to win in 77, I would imagine.
We were, because we had such a veteran team. We expected to be good, and we were pretty good. And and there was a little bit of back and forth in the newspaper between the FCAC and them sort of looking down at the NBL and the FCAC. Stanford Catholic, they're Trinity Catholic. Well, they're not in existence anymore. They went out of existence 2 years ago, but they really thought they were standing up for their league. They lost to Trumbull in the league championship 9-6, and the week before, and Trumbull went undefeated also. And they really were very. I thought they were a very confident team heading into it, and but as I said, we beat them by 2 touchdowns, and we were very pleased with the outcome.
Right. And I mean, at that point, now you win back to back. I think the goal is at this point each year is to win a state championship. I mean, obviously win your league first, but I really think the goal for Ansonia as time went on was to compete for a state championship, but definitely win it as well.
That was our goal, Mike. If you're going to be in it, you're in it to win it.
Right. So, Coach, I mean, talk to me, though, about like winning back-to-back state titles, being on a coaching staff, because I think what was really important, and I think what stood out about guys like yourself, Jack Hunt, Bill McAllister, Dell Volpe, and later on Lisi, is you knew what it was like to lose, and you lost for about 4 or 5 years where it was tough. So I think you appreciated these championships even more because you knew what it was like in the beginning when things weren't going as well.
We certainly did, Mike, and obviously the Derby situation was not over our head like it had been for so many years, and there was an aura of statewide football now that there wasn't before, because all of a sudden you're playing teams from different parts of the state for a state playoff game, and there was so much more publicity, so much more interest in the state playoffs because they just never had them before. It was a great interest for many fans. Even if your team wasn't making the finals, you were still going to the games. And in those days, there was only 8 teams that made it. So that's 8 out of 130 or so that are even going to the playoffs. Now there's many more, which is a lot better for most teams, I think. And but we were very pleased to, with the exception of a couple of years, to have always been in the playoffs.
Right. And Coach, when you got Naugatuck, Derby, and Shelton on your schedule, it's a tough road to never mind get to the playoffs, but to go undefeated. And the fact that this group of players 2 years in a row did that is something very special and remarkable, because the road is not easy to an undefeated season when you're playing teams like that, because sometimes you got to believe that as good as you play, somebody may play better than you sometimes. And the fact that these kids were able to respond and to go undefeated like that is really a credit to those players and how they listened to you guys as coaches. They did everything you guys instructed them to do, and the game plan you put out there, because those kids deserve a lot of credit because they're the ones out there playing and they have to be the ones to perform.
And so many of them had played the year before, which really helped us. And the other captain was Gary Eaton. He was a two-way player. He became a running back, but he had started on defense the year before. But I mean, there were probably, I'm just guessing, 12 people that played as sophomores or juniors the year before that came back for that team. So, they were part of a winning culture, and they certainly kept it going.
Right. And Coach, just the fact that 77 freshman team went undefeated, I think as coaches, you guys had to feel very good, because you saw that each time you had a sophomore group coming in, this was going to be a good group of kids. This was going to be a group of kids that could probably help you compete for a championship as time went on. I mean, the talent pool was just tremendous in Ansonia back then. I mean, you guys just produced so many great football players back then, and still do to this day.
The good players made it a lot easier to coach, Mike. I can tell you that.
Yeah, absolutely. So after the 77 season, you go into 78, and I mean, you got Sandy again, and I mean, you got, like you said, I think Tommy Lawler was a senior. You had guys coming back. So, I mean, again, it had to be state championship or bust, correct?
Well, that was our thought. We lost some outstanding seniors who graduated, but everybody has that problem. But they've been 2-year veterans of winning state championships. So, and then we also, and we had an outstanding linebacker in center and Joey Capola in the first scrimmage. We lost him for the whole year. Again, everybody has an injury. You just remember the ones that hurt your team that much, and you hated to see someone be lost for the whole year. But we still were playing very well. Derby was playing well that year, and we had a real big game with Derby down in Derby, and I think we fell behind. I think 6-0, but then we really got things going, and really Tommy Lawler was virtually impossible to stop. I think he had 5 catches for about 160 yards and 2 touchdowns, and he just had a field day, an outstanding career day, I should say. And you know, and when you're having Sandy Olszewski throw you the ball, you know, you could be 30, 40 yards downfield, and all of a sudden the ball comes in right into your hands. And so we were pretty fortunate that we had a senior running back named Michael Parks who had a huge game against Shelton earlier that year. He ran for about 270, 260 yards, I think, against Shelton, over at Shelton. And Shelton was obviously a decent team then. We beat them pretty good. So we were playing pretty well at the time.
Right. And Coach, the funny thing is about the Valley football, especially Derby and Ansonia, is, you know, you and I were talking off here before we went on about we're both Yankees fans, and, you know, we love them and stuff. And there are a ton of Yankees fans, Red Sox fans, Mets fans back then. But honestly, in the 70s, 80s, I mean, these guys who lived in Ansonia and Derby, what Derby and Ansonia football did that year meant more to them, honestly, than what maybe a team like the Yankees or the New York Football Giants, stuff like that. Because this was to them, this was their towns, and I mean, they lived for this, and that's like got to make you feel good as a coach back then, and I'm sure the players had to feel good because this was what people loved every Saturday.
Well, you know, Mike, I grew up in Derby, even though I didn't go to Derby High School. I went to many Derby athletic events, and you know, once Derby started their role against the Ansonia, they just expected to beat Ansonia every year. And then I started coaching Ansonia, and that was all Ansonia people cared about at the time, was beating Derby. I mean, it was amazing to me how important it was. And once it turned, they did a lot of rejoicing for many years that the fact that they could, having been on the short end of the stick for so many years, unlike very many other towns. I mean, I don't know of any other towns in the state where there was such a rivalry during that time. I mean, maybe you even take like New Canaan and Darien or something like that. You know, they would play on Thanksgiving Day, and first of all, there were never so many wins in a row for one town over the other, and it certainly made a lot of happy people in Ansonia the latter part of the 70s and on through since then.
Right. And I think, you know, you touched on it. You talked about what a rivalry it was. I mean, I think it was the 1988 season, the Madison Square Garden Network featured Derby and Ansonia. They did a big feature on them. They came to that game at Ryan Field. So, I mean, you've got the MSG network, which is big time. I mean, New York City, and they're coming to a small valley town to cover 2 valley rivals. So that just says a lot to me. And that's the one thing that kind of, you know, you get a little sad about, is that it probably isn't the same rivalry it once was. But boy, I'll tell you, I mean, that was the talk of the fall when it was Derby and Ansonia for many years.
Well, you know, so many kids in those days, their parents had played in the games, their uncles, their cousins, and you're just not getting quite that link that you had in previous years now. But even it's still Ansonia Derby when you were going out there that night to play the game. And I know what it means to coaches. I know what it means to the players, even though you move on to another game. But I mean, it's not quite with the intensity of ability of in the last few years. But by the same token, it still is Ansonia Derby, and we certainly don't want to look past Derby ever, because it's still a very, very important game on our schedule.
Right. And Coach, for you, let me just ask you. I mean, you know, prepare for that week, the entire week. Plus, you're coaching the freshmen, so you're preparing for Derby twice. Let me ask you, when the game is over, whether you win or lose, and while it feels great to win, I mean, when you get home that Saturday night, I mean, are you spent that Sunday morning where you're just like, this was a week where it was so exhausting because you did so many things? I mean, are you pretty much run down by that point.
If you win, Mike, you're not run down one iota. If you lose, Mike, you're run down for weeks.
Yeah, yeah.
Victory has a way of getting rid of the being run down, and defeat has a way of putting you down and keeping you down for a long time.
Right. Well, Coach, next week we're going to talk about 79, 1980, and 1981. But this is a lot of fun, and people are really enjoying this. And I mean, it's so good to talk football with you. And I mean, I think it's great with the football season going on. And I just look forward to this. And thank you again for coming on. This is so much fun.
Mike, it's my pleasure. It rekindles an awful lot of memories for me, and I've been very fortunate to coach such a great bunch of kids in Ansonia and to meet so many other great kids from the surrounding towns, but especially those from Derby.
Well, I appreciate it, Coach. And folks, that was Spooney's scrapbook. Of course, that's the great coach, John Sponheimer. I'm Mike Kenichi saying good night, everyone.